For those that listen to us, I'm iLiana Fokianaki. I'm a curator. I'm a director of a nonprofit institution in Athens called State of Concept that opened in 2013 here in the center of the city. And apart from that, I've been teaching for the Dutch Art Institute for the last years, and I've been curating internationally as a freelance curator in other institutions as well. So that's it more or less about me.
For introducing yourself.
Yeah.
What is interesting for me, like you are organizing these 3 different platforms. One is State of Concept. The third one is the new Bureau of Care. And I've seen as well online, but didn't see it before, just when I was looking for information before the interview about the future climates.
Well, Future Climates was the first one that we did with Antonia Lampi, a colleague of mine, but it has not been active the last year. So it's a project that it's somehow kind of ended, and all the findings will be included in a catalog that we're doing for the first 7 years of State of Concept. But the current 3 projects that I'm doing, I mean, State of Concept is an institution, of course, and there are several research platforms that are coming out of it. Future Climates was the first one, and now the second one is Gossips, who is looking into feminisms from intersectional positionings that are completely different and varied, that we have been doing with a new institute in Rotterdam and now with Goethe Institute in Athens, which will end also this December. We're having a last lecture series, and then it will be a book. And then the new one that we have just begun now in November is the Bureau of Care. So basically, let's say State of Concept is the platform from which other platforms emerge.
Can you say something on the beginning of the State of Concept?
It's a small-scale independent institution. I mean, for Greek standards, it's now a medium-scale institution, but for international ones, it's a small scale. We have a very small number of staff, and we have been looking into how to relate the current socio-political conditions of Greece and beyond, I would say Europe and beyond, and look into either more local or more global questions by addressing them from the specific position of Greece. So we have been working the last 7 years through solo exhibitions, mostly of international artists that haven't shown in Greece, but also platforming Greek artists, also freelance curators to do their programming. We're doing free one-to-one tutorials for students and artists. We have several events, workshops, other types of educational or pedagogic, if we can put it in quotation marks, activities. In relationship to the institution, of course, it's an institution that is very much a DIY structure. It's an institution that I started by myself without having any other staff or people. So in the beginning, it was me that was doing everything. And then quickly it grew into bringing people together. We will say that we're very much a feminist intersectional institution in the sense that we've only been hiring women the last 7 years that we operate, and usually it's women from dual backgrounds, mainly because I mean, apart from the fact that they had excellent CVs, it's also that we make it a point to hire individuals that have a dual background, because in Greece the last years there has been an extreme let's say shift in the way that migrants and refugees are dealt with from the public discourse, particularly after the financial crisis in 2017, which of course then you had more positive responses to the refugee question, but now unfortunately after 5 years this has shifted quite substantially.
Yeah. What was the first moment you thought about this to organize such a place like State of Concept? What was like your motivation to start the place?
Well, I have a background in art, actually. I wanted to be an artist, but when I went to the UK to study and very quickly realized that I'm better in reading and writing about art. I enjoy it much more than actually producing. So I lived in the UK for several years. I was running a commercial gallery in London, and very quickly realized in my early 20s that this was not really for me. And I had to return to Greece for family reasons, but it would I mean, at that moment, it was supposed to be a temporary return just for a few months, but very quickly realized that, I mean, Greece at the moment in 2031, 2005 that I came back, was literally a terra nullius in terms of independent structures and other types of institutions. We only had commercial galleries, big collectors that had their own foundations, and a contemporary art museum that was working at the moment when I returned, but very quickly 3 years later stopped operations for almost a decade, and now it's half working after Documenta arrived, but it will be full on working hopefully in a year's time. So I came back and I started very unconsciously to do some sort of mapping, I would say, of what exists in the local art ecology and what not. And very quickly I realized that there, you know, as I said before, there were no small-scale independent structures. So that's the idea that I first had. I first started writing about art and making a few exhibitions. Then I was considering, when the crisis, of course, in 2011 was quite intense, I was considering to leave again, but then I thought, you know, if everyone leaves, then there's no one left actually. So
yeah, I have this problem as well here in Poland.
Yeah, and I already began in 2011 to create Art Hub Athens was the name. And in 2 years' time, it became State of Concept. It had a local legal statute. It was, you know, properly, let's say, registered in the governmental bureaus. So since then,
and you just rented space privately?
Yes, we rent a space privately. We are one of the few actually that rent a space, and we don't have a space that is given to us from family or friends or etc. So, you know, one of the main things is also to be able to support the rent of the structure. We have a small support, a small grant every year that comes from Outsets Greece, the Greek office. Which is, I mean, Outset, for those of you who don't know, it's an international organization that has several offices of private collectors and donors that give money to projects and small-scale institutions, and then the rest we need to fundraise every year in order to be able to actually have a program running. So more or less, I mean, my idea was actually to bring into the game more socially and politically engaged practices, because in Greece there was not an institution that was focusing on that. I felt also that it was very important because of the moment, because of course 2012, 2011 to 2015 were extremely intense years for Greek politics and Greek economics. And I mean, we all remember, you know, how Greece was vilified, the Grexit and all these things. So for me, it was quite important to kind of bring these practices to the fore. Yeah, and we've been kind of developing ever since. We started with, let's say, more kind of simple propositions in relationship to discourse and exhibition subject matters, and we kind of honed in, we kind of grew as time went. And for me, I think it was also my curatorial practice growing through the institution, looking at curating as instituting in that sense, because as I said, we were always a very small team.
And what is the structure in the state right now, in the State of Concept? Is it you are the main curator, or there are other curators?
I am the main curator. We have always, once a year, we're inviting an international curator to curate a group exhibition. They can do whatever they want. They have a carte blanche. My only kind of rule is that they have to include one Greek artist, so it is a good opportunity for them to actually see a vast portfolio of works. I mean, that's what we mainly do, in the sense that we can't also afford to have internationals coming in, more than one every year. Then, I mean, we have 4 exhibitions usually every year. Since 2017, we have 8 because we have a second space in the basement where we're mainly showing artistic practices that are based on film. So from the 4 main exhibitions, one is a group curated by an international, or cannot also be local curators that do it. It has been done a year ago, well, less than a year ago, in February 2019, 2 Greek young curators did a project. And then it's one solo show of a Greek artist, and then remaining 2 is international ones. Of course, now with COVID, our whole program has been quite disrupted.
You wanted to start the place which is talking on politics and those kind of social issues. I know it's a very simple question, but I found it important to ask those simple questions. Why do you think Athens and maybe Greece itself needed, or why do we need the places like that?
Because they didn't exist. The current situation is very different, of course, because since 2013 that we've opened, we kind of ignited a whole ecology of a lot of artist-run institutions in small-scale spaces. There were efforts before, but they were more temporary institutions that operated during summer because they were in derelict buildings and they didn't have heating, they didn't have electricity.
Yeah, we have the same in Poland, exactly.
Yeah. But at the time, there was not a lot of discussion in relationship to art that I would say is not so market-friendly. Mainly because you just, as I mentioned, you only had contemporary commercial galleries and the big, like the Teste Foundation that brought artists like Sarah Lucas, Jeff Koons, etc., etc. So you had, let's say, the big scale exhibitions of big names, and then you had commercial galleries. And also, I mean, until now, I would say that the amount of discourse that is more, let's say, theoretical and critical and institutional critique based is very limited in Greece still. So we're hoping to kind of also push for that with other institutions to try to bring it more into the, into the highlight, let's say, into the limelight.
The new project you launched, Bureau of Care. I was briefly reading your article which you published on this project as well, and you are starting talking on the problem of self-care and care in the how we perceive and how we talk about this nowadays. We are starting from talking about narcissism in society.
Well, I mean, it's a 2-part essay. It's linked to a 2-part essay. I mean, just to say that this article was published now on eFlux, and these 2 other previous ones were also on that platform. So my introduction is trying to link my previous research with my current one. I'm using a particular theory and theorist who is Greek-French. His name was Nikos Pouladjas. He committed suicide in 1979 in Paris, and he was a very important figure in state theory coming from a Marxist position. And he was discussing authoritarian statism, that is his concepts, specifically for countries that have just exited dictatorships. And I think it's very interesting to talk about this today as well, because today is a commemoration of the Polytechnic School in Athens during the dictatorship on 17th of November. So basically, Pouladjas starts describing, I would say, the beginning of neoliberalism and the globalization of the market through also the change of the state. And he's discussing how the state is slowly depriving citizens of liberties and has an authoritarian profile. And of course, when I started thinking about this concept, it was about 2016, 2017, when you had the first Trump administration in the US, and then you had Bolsonaro in Brazil, you had Orban. You had a lot of things. I mean, here. Polish audiences exactly know very, very well what I'm talking about. So I was very interested to look into how these figures emerge now in a state that is very much a state corporation, because, you know, neoliberalism and the globalization of the market has really created a new form of the state. So trying to further his line of thinking, I was the first and the foremost characteristic that I was witnessing was narcissism from all these leaders. But what is interesting for me is to talk about leaders that have been elected and not about the classic, let's say, authoritarian regimes that we know where we have dictatorships. So in supposed democracies, what is the current profile of power? I mean, I would say the common thread throughout my research and my practice and my curatorials is that, like, looking into formations of power, looking into power structures, and trying to think of them through particular geopolitics and through also psychoanalysis. That's why I've kind of inserted narcissism into it. So my proposal is NAS, narcissistic authoritarian statism. So trying to further a little bit Pouladza's thinking. Mainly because this narcissism also is very much linked with the idea of not being punished for what you do. You have this kind of sense of superiority because of the global market, because of capitalism, because of neoliberalism, because of corruption, because of using social media for fake news and propaganda. You create a new reality where also you are immune to any to the law many times. And we've seen that, of course, with Trump and all these others that have emerged lately. So
it's the same what is happening in rising this Polish soul in Poland, that the nationalism is so...
Of course, nationalism is very much linked to that, but it's not just nationalism. It's always, the narrative goes nationalism together with growth and progress. And this growth and progress is a very twisted idea of what progress and growth is. It's one that is including a lot of environmental disasters and stuff like that. Corruption, tax evasion, etc., etc. But anyway, the first deck was trying to kind of, let's say, highlight and contour these sort of power, and the second one was addressing the violences of this power, and I was looking more into this kind of binary of slow and fast violence that Rob Nixon, a theorist from the States, has very much discussed about. And now this third text, I'm trying to focus on a, let's say, a proposition against these types of powers. And one of the violences that we, of course, witness very much strongly because of COVID, I mean, not only because it had existed before, but now it has been made to us very, very evident, is the fact that all forms of care are being diminished. So
can you
this
talk,
text that
can you talk more about a little bit about what do you mean by how the care is diminished nowadays?
Well, I mean, it's very clear. We don't have the health benefits that we used to have. There is no care from the state for protection of its citizens. We see it globally now with COVID. There are many governments that are choosing to continue running their economies to the detriment of their citizens. They're not very much interested in pensioners because they don't, they consume, but they don't produce as much. So they are the ones that it's very easy for them to go. We don't have the welfare state that we had in the 80s in most of the countries in Europe, I would say. Greece is one of the last examples where this type of kind of socialist democracy still a little bit in terms of health is there. And I would say France also, from the countries that I've lived in, I know their health systems in any case. I mean, care for the elderly has been diminishing, but also care for politics itself. We see citizens being all the more withdrawing from being active citizens, participating in elections, participating in demonstrations and marches and complaints, and all these types of dissents that are legal forms of dissent, let's say. Not that there are no reactions from citizens, but I think that they have lessened a lot since the 70s and the 80s.
It's
So
very interesting as well. Sorry, that what is happening in Poland now, the women uprising, which is still going, and right now there is the forming the people who are going to, who are saying their manifesto and want to actually change many parts of politics, which is of course about women, about as well elder people and LGBT.
yes, of course. I mean, the question of how feminism plays its role into kind of bringing these questions to the fore is a very prominent question. But what I wanted to say is that for me, also the concept of collective care has been very much lost. So to answer also again to the first part of your question, I'm trying to discuss how we see neoliberalism really proposing care as another new market that they are very happy to explore and exploit. So there's a lot of self-care that is discussed. You see multi-million-dollar companies like Google that they have playrooms in there, or they have yoga rooms or meditation rooms, etc. So it's all about how do you provide care for your own self, but we have completely forgotten the idea of care as a collective endeavor, as a collective act that also entails collective joy, and care that is provided also as a human right, because healthcare, for instance, is a human right. So this focusing on individualized ideas of care, and this is one characteristic, of course, of neoliberalism, individualization, is one that I'm trying to kind of examine somehow and propose different ways of looking at that. And then, the project arrives because it starts from the institutional critique position of what is the art institution, what can the art institution do, how many art institutions, specifically during the pandemic period and because of BLM, who turned to be a global movement, how they are very quick to be woke all of a sudden and to really, propose care and care practices and everything. But unfortunately, institutions have been extremely careless the last decades. And we know that because since the civil rights movement in the States, since the 60s until today, the questions of racial equality in the museum, of diversification of staff, of diversification of programming, of addressing a program that actually involves the majority of your audiences, power structures, how many women are hired, do they have positions of power, how are funds distributed, etc., etc. There have not been careful practices these decades, and I think now, specifically in relationship to COVID, we've seen that because the first people that left the museums, that got fired or were on furlough, were zero-hour workers, were flex workers, were people that were in education departments. Anything that was deemed unnecessary was just tossed. And then, of course, there were budgets that included thousands of dollars and euros of banquets for donors, etc., that were not taken and redistributed in order for people not to get fired. So for me, I start from that position that we're very happy and eager to talk about care, but it's a little bit hypocritical to talk about care when we don't look properly at how do we practice care in the art institution, who, even if it is a small scale one, is an institution of power, is an institution that emulates the power structures of heteronormative patriarchy. So that is my first question. And the second one is, okay, then if we haven't done a good job, who do we look towards in order to be able to learn and do the job better? And of course, institutions are very happy to look at theory. And theory is fantastic and great. But theory, many times, we know that of academia, is very detached from society. So my idea is how to actually look at the structures of care that have been going on for decades, be it civil society, small structures, squats, groups of individuals, that have been providing care, that have created structures for care, mainly structures that are outside of the state machine, and they have been doing it very successfully. So how do we look into that and see if the art institution can learn things from it? And I mean, learning, the idea of learning is not my favorite word, but for a lack of a better word, that is that we need to kind of step aside and also bring in these voices that have what one would call non-epistemic knowledges to the fore, and have them as equal partners, as main driving forces. So this is the project, more or less. We're going to be working with a lot of non-profit institutions, collectives, journalists, etc., to learn from them and to see what are their how-tos and their modus operandi in relationship to care, and its practices, its politics and ethics. And hopefully this will be a physical publication in a year's time, and possibly a small exhibition that will travel in several institutions.
And do you want to do it through sharing the experience from people who are invited to the project, or to took each of the to like find a new way, which is, let's say, one written law of how to do it, or it's based on different ones and comparing them?
It's different ones. As I said, it's going to be a lot of different meetings that they're going to most probably be conducted online at the moment. And then our task is to see what of that is applicable for a structure of an art institution, and create something that would provide, let's say, a future of how to institute.
And to actually, you are thinking as well to trying to put it, like, talk with the politicians and to change it in the higher level, or on the level?
No, we're not going to be discussing that with politicians, because I mean, it's there for the politicians if they want to look at it, but that's not my interest. I don't think that institutions need politicians to tell them how to do it. It's usually institutions that tell politicians how to do it.
You are using this term of care right now in the new project. Like, we are running this Domie thing in Poland, and this is the topic we are from the beginning discussing, and as well in the sense how the communities are gathering, and how they are like created and from which reasons. And I don't know, I would say what I can see in Poland, that the idea of the care, which is not just me and my family, it has changed after the 89, after when there was the communist time before, and after it people they have this need of wanting to have something for themselves. So to work for the bigger space, like bigger care, like us as even a group, or as a society, it's really hard to understand here in Poland.
I know, I understand, but I think that's also related exactly to what you said, that you have been under a communist regime, as many countries in Eastern Europe have been under. So it's extremely difficult. It's a very different premise from which we both begin. I begin from a country that did not have that in 1949, you know, the left powers lost, and it was always kind of a unfulfilled promise of what would happen if we had socialism. Of course, you know, the apt examples of socialism have not been the best, unfortunately, but this is, of course, the eternal question of, are we looking to what has, you know, how it was executed, or are we looking at the pure ideas of socialism? And of course, unfortunately, you cannot, you know, excise it completely from this idea or let's say this ideology of politics, because neoliberalism also, of course, had its very important role to play into how societies have become very much individualized. And what the example that you gave, I think, is quite important in the sense that, yeah, it's not that we have become all robots and we don't care about people, but we care about the people that are in our immediate environment, our friends and our family, and possibly our neighborhood, which even today, not so much. It might be, oh, we care about the garbage that are not being collected from our neighborhood, or we care about the noise that youth is making in our neighborhood, but it stops somewhere there. So the idea of collective consciousness in relationship to your political position has somehow kind of weaned the last 20 to 30 years. It's not just because states are not in communist regimes, because you also see changes in China that is a communist capitalist state. It's state capitalism, basically. That this has shifted. I think it has to do more with consumerism and neoliberalism and this turbo-capitalist condition that we live rather than anything else. And extreme competition also that is created. You have to care for those that are very close to you, that you have emotional bonds with, but then you are completely separated for those of you that might be living in the next apartment from you. It's difficult many times to discuss these positions in relationship to care and collective care, because of course many times, specifically in countries like Poland, they bring back these types of memories and people might be a little bit more, let's say, reluctant. Mm-hmm. However, if we try to separate them and we try to only use logic, I think these types of positions make sense. We see it at the very moment in the United States, that has had 4 very difficult years, and there has been a lot of collectivization of struggles, let's say. There has been a lot of civil society structures that have been created because of Trump, specifically coming from the feminism, from feminist platforms, but not only. All persons of color in the United States have been demonstrating, and I think that's quite interesting to see it, because it's if there is one turbo-capitalist state, that is of course the United States. It's interesting to see it, but also for me, as I'm mentioning also in the text, it's important to understand that these types of practices and this way of being, let's say, and way of thinking, goes very much back to indigenous philosophies and ways of being that are preceding any socialist ideology. There is from Australia and New Zealand and Maori cultures to Native Americans to Mayan minorities that are still existing in the majority of the northern part of South America. We see these legacies of community and collective ways of being that have been there for eons and eons. And it's mainly women, of course. Many of these societies were also matriarchal. So I think it's interesting, if we want to somehow depart from the modern ideology of politics in relationship to these questions, we will find an answer in previous times, or structures that are outside of the white, Western, Christian, heteronormative idea of how a society should work.
Do you believe that it's a possibility of horizontal hierarchy? I mean, not hierarchy, but horizontal way of working?
Yes, there is. Of course, there is. And we have, again, a lot to learn from all these civil rights movements and civil society structures in terms of horizontal hierarchies or horizontal structures of power. However, there is the common mistake in general, I would say, in the public consciousness, that all these structures, leftist structures or anarchist structures, are structures that don't have a structure. That are not very well organized, which is a complete lie and a misconception, because they're usually extremely well organized. And there are hierarchies. The issue is that these hierarchies circulate. So you might be in a position of cooking for some people for 1 week, and then you will be doing the admin, and then you will be organizing the whole group, and then you will be doing. So this flexibility to relinquish power for me is much more interesting. That you are happy and willing to, you know, to shift from one place to the next, but the structures themselves exist. The thing is, who is sitting in which position of the structure and for how long.